What if I told you? There are official records hidden in plain sight, describing a workforce that wasn't human, that consumed 5 times more food than soldiers, and then disappeared without a trace. No explanation. No history. Just silence. It didn't start with a discovery, not a hidden vault, not a secret file. It started with something so small, most people would never even notice it. A single note buried at the bottom of a page. I almost skipped it. I was digging through old military records, dusty, slow, painfully boring stuff. The kind of documents nobody reads unless they absolutely have to. Supply routes, food distribution, movement of troops. Nothing unusual, nothing exciting. At least that's what I thought. Then I saw it. A short line in the margin. Barely a sentence. It referred to a certain group within the Army logistics system, translated simply as the unusual labor division. At first, it didn't mean anything, just another vague historical phrase, but something about it felt wrong. I kept reading. And that's when things started to shift. The document described how this labor group was transported, not in standard wagons like soldiers. Not even like equipment, but in specially reinforced carriers built differently, stronger, larger. That detail stood out, because in every other section of the same record, normal wagons were described clearly. But this was something else. So I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was heavy machinery. Siege weapons, cannons, something massive. That would make sense, right? But then I reached the next section, and that explanation fell apart instantly. Feeding schedules, detailed, precise. Measured carefully. And when I calculated the numbers, each unit in this labor group consumed 4 to 5 times more food than a regular soldier per day. Let that sink in. Machinery doesn't eat. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a sudden realization. More like a quiet discomfort, the kind that sits in the back of your mind and refuses to leave. So I stepped away, closed the file, told myself I was overthinking, but I came back, because something didn't fit, and when things don't fit, they usually mean something. At that time, I trusted the official explanation of history, that these regions' vast, unexplored areas were simply labeled loosely by map makers, that there was no hidden empire. No lost civilization. And definitely no giants. In fact, history is very clear about that. Any claims of giant human remains, mistakes. Exaggerations. Or outright hoaxes. And honestly, that makes sense. People have faked stranger things. So I held onto that belief, even as the questions started growing, until I found the second document. Different country, different archive, different language. No connection at all. And yet, it described the same thing. This time, it wasn't hidden in a footnote. It was written plainly. Cold, administrative, almost boring. A government report discussing a labor issue, scheduling problems, worker management. Containment. And the workers, they were described using a word that translates directly to giants, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally. Now here's what made it disturbing. It didn't read like a myth. It didn't sound like a story. There was no sense of wonder. No shock. It read like paperwork. Routine. Normal. Like whoever wrote it wasn't surprised at all. They weren't documenting something impossible. They were dealing with a problem involving workers that were too large to manage easily. At first, I tried to explain it away. Maybe the word giant was just a figure of speech, a way to describe strong men, big men, difficult men. That happens in language all the time. But then came a detail I couldn't ignore. The report mentioned that standard barriers, fences, enclosures didn't work, not because the workers were rebellious, not because they were aggressive, because the barriers were simply not enough. To small. And suddenly, that word, giant, didn't feel like a metaphor anymore. It felt literal. That's when everything changed, because once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I went back, started searching differently, looking for things I would have ignored before, and then I found more. Another record. Another country. Another time period. Same description. Large workers, separate food supply. Special handling. Then another, and another. Different languages, different governments. No connection between them, but the same quiet detail repeated again and again. A workforce that didn't fit normal human limits, and no one in those documents questioned it. No one reacted like it was impossible, because to them, it wasn't. And that's the part that should bother you the most. Not the idea that giants might have existed, but the idea that they were once treated as normal. So here's the question no one wants to ask: if multiple governments, across different centuries, were documenting the same thing calmly, routinely, without surprise, then what exactly were they seeing that we're no longer allowed to? Because the deeper I went into those records, the more consistent the pattern became, until I reached a final document, one that didn't just describe them, it explained where they came from. And that's when I realized this was never supposed to be found. By the time I reached the next set of records, I already knew something wasn't right, but I still wasn't prepared for how far it would go, because the pattern didn't stop. It spread across continents, across centuries, across civilizations that had no reason to agree on anything. The next document came from East Asia. Old, carefully preserved, written in a style that felt precise, controlled, almost cautious. It described a group of workers assigned to remote northern regions, mountain zones where construction was considered nearly impossible, but these workers weren't described like normal laborers. Their title didn't translate cleanly. The closest meaning, those who carry bodies shaped beyond the common form. Historians had already seen this term and dismissed it, filed it away as a regional classification, something vague, something unimportant. But when I read it after everything else I had seen, it didn't feel vague anymore. It felt familiar. Then came another record from a completely different empire. Different language, different culture, different purpose. This one wasn't about construction. It was about defense. A narrow mountain pass, heavily fortified, strategically critical, and within that report, a strange detail, a special unit assigned to the area, described as towering soldiers, used not just for combat, but for physically holding and shaping the terrain itself. The document didn't glorify them, didn't exaggerate. It simply listed what they required: food, water, space, and the numbers didn't make sense. The supply calculations were massive. Far beyond what normal soldiers would ever need. At that moment, I stopped, not because I had proof, but because I had something more dangerous: a pattern, and patterns are tricky. They don't prove anything, but they make it harder to ignore what you're seeing. So I forced myself to step back. To question everything. Maybe this was coincidence. Maybe different cultures used similar words to describe strong men, tall men, intimidating men. Maybe history had simply exaggerated physical size over time. That happens. And maybe I was connecting things that were never meant to be connected. That possibility scared me more than anything, because it meant the pattern wasn't real. It meant I was creating it. So I tested it. I went back through every document, every line, every translation, looking for mistakes, looking for simpler explanations. And in many cases, I found them, but not in all of them, because there was one detail that kept coming back, quietly, repeatedly. A change, not a beginning, not a description. An ending. In several of the records, the same workforce, whatever it was, simply that disappearance was never normal. It wasn't words like decline or relocation. It wasn't illness, or aging, or migration. It was something else. Controlled. Intentional. One record described it as a final resolution. Another hinted at actions taken under authority beyond local command. One didn't explain it at all. It just stated, coldly, that the workforce was no longer available. But the line that stayed with me, the one I couldn't shake, came from a report written far from the others. Different empire. Different purpose. At the very end of a long logistical summary, the writer added a single note. He didn't explain what happened. He didn't justify it. He just wrote that the workers had been removed, according to instructions that did not need to be recorded. I read that line over and over again, because that's not how normal history is written. That's how something is written when the details are too dangerous to exist. At that point, I had to face something uncomfortable. This wasn't proof, not in the way historians demand, but it wasn't random either, because when I laid all the documents side by side, one truth became impossible to ignore: different civilizations, different languages, different governments, all describing the same kind of workforce. All treating it as normal. And then, all quietly acknowledging its disappearance, using almost the same kind of language. That's not coincidence, that's consistency. And consistency across systems that never communicated is where things stop being accidental. And start becoming Deliberate. So I asked the question that changed everything. If this workforce was real, what was it? And more importantly, what kind of world allows something like that to exist, only to erase it completely? Because these records don't describe cooperation, they don't describe partnership, they describe control. Management. Containment. Like something powerful, but not powerful enough to refuse. And that leads to a darker possibility, not that these beings were part of society, but that they were used by it. Across generations, across empires, until one day, someone decided they shouldn't exist anymore. Now think about this carefully. If each civilization discovered this independently, why does the language of removal sound the same? Why do different empires separated by distance, culture, and time describe the same kind of ending, in almost the same way? That doesn't happen naturally, unless there was something deeper. Not a meeting, not an agreement, but a shared understanding. Something so widely known that it never had to be explained, something so dangerous that it was never meant to be written clearly. And once I realized that, one final possibility started forming, a possibility hidden between the lines of fragmented records, barely mentioned, almost erased, a conflict. Not between nations, but between something else entirely. And if that's true, then what we've been calling history might actually be the aftermath of something much bigger. Something that ended long before we were ever supposed to know about it, because the deeper I looked, the more it felt like these records weren't describing random events. They were describing the same moment, from different angles, and whatever happened in that moment didn't just remove them. It erased the reason they were here in the first place, and the only thing left behind are fragments like these, which raises one final question. If they were all removed, if every trace was meant to disappear, then why do these documents still exist? And more importantly, what were they trying to make sure we never remembered? Because the last piece I found didn't describe their work or their disappearance. It described what they were before any of this began. By the time everything came together, I wasn't looking at random records anymore. I was looking at something that felt coordinated. Not coordinated in the way people imagine. No secret meetings, no written agreements. Something quieter than that. A pattern formed not by communication, but by experience. Because across different regions, different empires, different languages, the same shift kept appearing. At first, these workers were managed. Controlled. Contained. Then suddenly, that stopped working. Something changed. It's subtle in the records, easy to miss. A complaint about containment here, a strange note about control failing there. Nothing dramatic. But enough to suggest that whatever these beings were, they were no longer easy to handle. And then, slowly, the language changes, not describing problems anymore, describing solutions. Permanent ones. One report hints that the issue had been fully resolved. Another implies that action was taken beyond local authority. And then there are the lines that don't explain anything at all, but somehow say everything. Short, cold, final, like someone closing a chapter, without writing what actually happened inside it. At that point, I stopped trying to convince myself this was coincidence, because coincidence doesn't repeat like this, across continents, across centuries, with the same tone, the same silence, the same kind of ending. And that's when a new possibility began to form. Not a theory, not a conclusion, a question. What if this wasn't just disappearance? What if it was something closer to a decision? Because the language used in those records doesn't sound like illness. It doesn't sound like natural decline. It sounds like action. Organized. Planned. Executed. The kind of action that requires structure. Authority. Resources. The kind of action that leaves behind records, but not explanations. And that's why one word kept returning to my mind, not lightly, not carelessly, but carefully. Reluctantly. War. Not a war we were taught, not one with dates, names, or heroes, a different kind of war, one that ends not with victory, but with silence. Because think about it, you don't write phrases like no further detail required for something that ended naturally. You write that when something was done intentionally, and no one wants to explain why. Now here's the part that stayed with me the longest. When people hear the word inhuman, they imagine monsters. Something non-human, something alien. But that's not what I saw in these records. What I saw was something much more disturbing, because the inhuman part wasn't what they were. It was what was done to them. A system where something, or someone, was used. Controlled. Managed. And then removed. Not because it vanished, but because it became inconvenient. Now place that against the history we've been taught. An era of progress. Of reason. Of growing human rights. And maybe that's true, but what if that same period was also hiding something else? Something that didn't fit the story, because buried beneath that progress, inside forgotten records, inside lines nobody reads twice, is a different version of events, one where another kind of human or something close enough to be called that was quietly erased. And I really tried, to find another explanation, something simpler, something safe, but every time I looked again, I found more. Another record. Another hint. Another fragment that didn't quite belong. A distant report describing workers brought from far regions, not locally found. A financial record listing the final handling of a labor group, with costs that didn't make sense for ordinary dismissal. Each one small on its own, but together, they form something harder to ignore. Not proof, but not nothing either, something in between. And that's the worst place to be, because you're left with a pattern that feels real, but refuses to fully reveal itself. A story that exists, but only in pieces. And when you step back and look at it as a whole, one final thought becomes impossible to avoid. If something like this really existed, and if it was removed, carefully, deliberately, completely, then the world we live in right now is built on top of whatever came after that moment, not knowing it happened, because the silence wasn't accidental. It was designed, and somewhere, in some archive that hasn't been opened, in some language that hasn't been translated, there is a record, a final one, the one that doesn't just hint, or imply, or avoid the truth but actually says it. Who made the decision, why it was carried out, and what they were so afraid of, that they chose to erase it completely. I haven't found that record, but I know it exists, because everything else points to it. And now I'm left with something I can't ignore. Not the documents, not the pattern, but the realization that this silence was never meant to be broken, that this story was never supposed to be put back together. And yet, somehow, it is. And that leaves one final question. If the door to this history was meant to stay closed, then why does it feel like someone left it slightly open? And what happens if we open it the rest of the way?